Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial. Our topic is the Helvetians parley with Caesar, which is an adapted text from Caesar's De Bello Gallico, one of the more famous texts in Latin literature and history. Here we have a brief description. Caesar here illustrates how he, as commander, dux of the Roman forces in Gaul, which is modern-day France, deals with an arrogant adversary. The word arrogant is the Latin insolenter, where we also get the word insolent in the English language. Let's jump right into it. Contre Helvetios qui in agros populorum vinci orum inveribant, Caesar bellum suscipit, cum potuisit uno dia pontum in arre facere et suum exercitum traducere, Helvetii qui deibus viginti idem difficilime confecerant, legatus ad eum miserunt. Hi ita dix erunt, si pacem populos Romanus nobis cum faciet in illis finibus ubi voleris manibimus. Sed si bello nos diutius primere in animo habes, cogite de antique fame nostrae, ita enima patribus maioribusque nostris didicimus ut magis virtute bellum geramus quam insidiis. Quod si contra nos tuum exercitum duces, non solum salutem tuam, sed etiam honoram populi Romani certi amites. His Caesar ita respondit, etiam si vestorum priorum vitiorum memoriam deponere possem, certe non possum ignoscere vestris novis scleribus, nisicos obsedes dabitis pacem vobicosque non faciam. Helvetii sit Caesare cum concisient meliorium fortunam inveni essent, sed insolenter responderunt, nobis a maioribus nostris in hic most traditus est, Helvetii obsedes excipiunt non dant. All right, as usual, we have quite a bit of a helpful vocabulary on the margins here, which you'll want to learn as part of your exam. We should be able to recognize right away that we have a preposition, contre, followed by the accusative. So I hope you have your declension chart out or memorized at this point. Second declension, accusative plural is os. So there is our Helvetios, contre Helvetios. Who are the Helvetii? Well, you can see the Helvetians, one of the tribes living in ancient Gaul, now modern-day France and Switzerland. So against the Helvetians, who in the fields of the nearby population were invading, Caesar took up a war. So here is our main subject and verb. So we can probably maybe start with that. Caesar suscipit is the past tense of suscipio, so we need to be able to recognize that. He began a war, or maybe took up, you take up arms. So we're going to keep that somewhat literal. And we're going to say Caesar took up a war. So as often the case with writing, you want to make sure you have your notebook out. You should be taking notes. And then took up a war against the Helvetians. And then here is our relative pronoun who, and then our verb invedibant. We can guess that means here. Here they're actually giving us a slight variation of that, to rush in, to fall upon. were seizing. So in that case, let's go with that one. So bombe spant, bombo spante spant is our imperfect third person plural, who were seizing, or I guess, I don't know, like that, who were rushing into the neighboring fields. I'm going to go ahead and write that, and then I'll explain that a little bit further. So what was Caesar responding at? He was responding against the Helvetians, who, so qui is referring back to the Helvetians, and they were rushing in upon, falling upon, seizing into the fields, so agros, of the neighboring, literally of the neighboring people. The context of this is there were a variety of tribes that Caesar encountered and fought against as part of the so-called Gallic Wars. And so the Helvetians are sort of, in this context, on the move, and they have invaded or rushed upon fields that Caesar himself does not want to allow them to enter into, is sort of the context of that. Here we have cum, which can mean, as you know, as so often the case with Latin, we need to make sure we're looking up words just to make sure we know what we're doing here. You can see cum can mean a variety of things. Only the context will tell you. And so it can either be a conjunction, an adverb, or even a preposition. We've said several times it can't be a preposition because the word that follows would be a noun in the ablative, which we don't have here. We have a verb. So we should be able to recognize that. And then we're going to have to, of course, look up the words. So you're going to have something like this. When, was able, one day, bridge, in, river, avrar, to do, and his army to lead across. The Helvetians, who 20 days, the same difficulty, had finished. Ambassadors to him they sent. So here's an instance where we have a longer sentence, and as we said before, we need to approach this, in my view, by using the punctuation, in this case the commas. We have 2 commas and a period, and we need to chunk this or take it clause by clause. So let's start with this one right here. As often, we may have to slightly revise the final sentence just because English prefers the subject and verb early in the sentence. So what we have here is when he was able, or I guess maybe since he was able to make a bridge across the river Avrar, and in one day, and to lead his army across. Let me go ahead and write this down, and then I'll try to explain it in a little more detail. So the subject here implied is Caesar. Okay, so let's take a look at this here. So this is a famous moment in Caesar's De Bello Gallico where the speed of Caesar shocks the enemy. As you'll see, the contrast here is they were able to build a similar bridge, but it took them 20 days. Caesar and Caesar's men were able to do it in 1 day, so they're already sort of shocked and awed by the speed in which Roman engineering is able to complete this task, is sort of the context of this. So when he was able, so this is simply potuist, this goes back to chapter 1, and this goes back to this simple modal verb. And then you can see here's our perfect stem, simply followed with the, what makes this is in the pluperfect active subjunctive third person singular, just because it is a cum clause. And a cum clause in Latin requires the subjunctive, even though we talked about this in an earlier chapter. We can translate it in the indicative. We don't need the subjunctive necessarily. So, but there it is, right? The third person singular pluperfect active subjunctive. Again, the subject implied is Caesar. And so when he was able, or since he was able, and then literally to do, but in this case to build a pontum. A pontum is third declension accusative singular em. In this case, refers back to bridge. And then here's our time expression in 1 day in the ablative. And he was also able to ducere, to lead his army, suum exercitum, this is fairly straightforward Latin, across this bridge, across the river Arar. And so they give us, right, what that is. It's a, we don't have a map to refer to, but it's a river that is the geographical point of focus in this passage. But then the Helvetians, who had made with difficulty the same, in this case, the same bridge. Edom just means the same, but it took them 20 days, right? So Viginti is 20. So let's go ahead and write that out. So the Helvetians, Helvetii, who had done the same, I think I left out the adverb here, who had done the same okay, so the Helvetians who had done the same with difficulty, that's the difficilime, could also be with the greatest difficulty, perhaps, since it isn't a superlative. So with difficulty in 20 days, but then they sent, so mito, mitere, misi, misum, so here's the perfect form of mito, M-I-T-T-O. They sent legatos, which are ambassadors, to him. So that's a fairly straightforward sentence if we break it apart and look up the words. And then we should be able to recognize at this point, legatos is second declension, accusative plural. Ad is simply a preposition. Here's our personal pronoun in the accusative masculine. And then here's our basic verb going back to a much earlier chapter. Mito, mitere. So I'll just type in the simple present form. You can see mis erunt, so that's third person plural, they sent. In this case, they sent the ambassadors. He is a demonstrative pronoun. It means these. Literally, these, thus said. But here, it's just the way Latin works, perhaps giving it a kind of emphasis. We might want to perhaps just change this into a regular pronoun, but it's referring back to the Helvetians based on the context. But he is a demonstrative pronoun, and so just kind of using it for sort of emphasis, right? So these men, or these Helvetians, referring back to these ambassadors here. In fact, we could say these ambassadors. Itas is thus, or therefore. And what did they say? They said, so they're talking to Caesar, is if you will make, right, so if the Roman people will make peace with us, I'm going to go ahead and write that down, and then I'll try to explain it in a little bit more detail. C is a conjunction, part of the grammar in this chapter, namely conditionals. So introducing a conditional clause, notice that our verb is in the future tense. We need to be able to recognize that as well. If we're not sure, like anything else in learning, you want to look it up. But there it is, future active indicative third person singular, one of the more common verbs, facio. So if you will make pacem, third declension accusative singular, and then Roman people is the subject in this clause. So Romanus populus, as you know, Latin likes to put, in this case, the adjectival noun after the noun or subject in this clause. So if the Roman people will make peace with us, in those lands or in those borders where you wish, we will remain. So I'm going to go ahead and, so here's our bo bibi bibi boo. Manio means to stay, like remain. So I'm going to go ahead and write that first, just given the syntax. I think it makes it a little bit easier to understand. They're literally in the borders, but in the areas, or in those places, we will remain in the borders. As is often the case in Latin, we have some options in terms of how we want to read this here. So, finibus, we will remain in those, maybe territories might be a little bit better actually. So let me go ahead and change that slightly. Remember, the context of this is during the Gallic Wars. There's many tribes, or numerous tribes, sort of migrating to and fro. And traditionally, these tribes had been a sore spot on Rome's northern border, going back many years, even centuries. And so Rome is, in this case, Caesar's trying to restrain them so that they are no longer a trouble for Rome's northern borders, modern-day northern Italian peninsula. So fairly straightforward there. But, so these ambassadors, they continue, but if war us while press in mind have, think about ancient fame are. So as always, you need to look up these words. And so what they're saying here is that we will remain here, right, if you wish, but if you continue to press war with us, then, be careful, because as you have learned earlier, at least as Rome has learned earlier. Again, this is a reference to some centuries earlier when Rome wasn't quite as strong as in the case of during Caesar's time. They're sort of suggesting that, we'll take the fight to you, and you might want to take advantage of this opportunity for pacem, peace, or peace. But if you have in mind, so sed si animo habes, so here it's referring to Caesar. But if you have in mind, and then have in mind what? To continue war. Literally to press. Premere means to press, but in this case to continue. To press on all right, so I gave that somewhat of a free translation. Let me try to explain what I've done with this. But if you have in mind, literally to press, so if you look at premere, remember our main goal is to read and understand Latin, not necessarily to translate it, but press, pursue, oppress. So this is just the verb that Latin uses to carry on or continue with a war. With a war against us. So there's with the war and the second declension ablative singular. And then cogite, where we get the word think. So the idea is just, again, this is a reference to remember what we did to you some time ago, sort of the sense of what these ambassadors are telling Caesar. So I put remember. Remember our ancient fame, our ancient strength. I put valor here just because I think that sounds a little bit strange to say remember our ancient rumor or our ancient reputation. Although ancient reputation might also work because fama in Latin, where we get the word fame, as you can see, it can mean rumor, reputation, tradition, fame, report. So I've given that a kind of free translation because I think it fits the context. Carrying on here, for thus, so as always with Latin, I think we need, if we're translating it, we need to find the subject and the verb, which is right here. This is didikimus, where we get the word think, or rather to teach or to learn, or to become acquainted with something or skilled in something. So we're going to have to keep that in mind as we read this one, because the syntax in this might be a little bit tricky. For thus is ita anum. So I'm going to go ahead and write that to see if that helps us here. So that is just our anum is literally for, but then Latin likes to put ita in the first position and anum in the second. So when we're reading and translating, we're just going to switch that word order. For thus, we have learned. There's our subject and verb. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. And then learned what? By our For thus we have learned by our ancient or by our older forefathers. Is sort of, so we have ablative here because we have a followed by the ablative, and then ibus are both third declension ablative plural. So there's our ibus. And then we also have nostris, which is going to be second declension, ablative plural. So ablative, as we've said many times, is kind of the tricky part, but that's sort of the sense of it here. Again, the basic idea is they're warning Caesar. Remember one time when Rome wasn't quite as strong? Of course, they don't realize that Rome is much stronger necessarily now, but although they have some sense of it, given how quickly Caesar built this bridge. But they're saying, right, that once upon a time, remember what happened to your armies. Ut magis, remember ut introduces a purpose clause. And what have we been at? And so to wage war with great strength, not deception. So let me go ahead and write this out, and then I'll try to explain it. For thus we have learned by our ancient forefathers So quam is used for comparison. So, and then insidious is the word where we get words like insidious, or insidious rather, in English, which is negative in this case, meaning treachery. So once again, I cannot stress enough, this is something you really should be doing. So insidious can mean ambush, plot, treachery. The basic idea here is that we are strong too, and we're not just going to fight a guerrilla warfare where we're sort of hiding in a game of chicken, but rather we have learned, we too have a long distinguished history of warfare, and magis virtute bellum. And again, if you don't accept our peace, Caesar, then we too are great warriors, and we will take the fight to you, not just you taking it to us. But then it goes on here, because, quad means because if against us, so because if you lead your army against us, let me go ahead and write that out and I'll explain that. This one is fairly straightforward. Once again, if we get this is in the future tense, but in English we could say if you lead, if you will lead. If you want to say if you will lead, that's fine too. But because if you lead, and then lead what? Your army. So that is second declension, accusative singular, and then against us. So that one's fairly straightforward if we know the vocab. Not only your safety, but also as you'll see here, I put the verb all the way at the end because that's how the original Latin is, but we might want to move this earlier in the sentence. So they're saying, once again, that we too are strong, and if you decide to lead your army against us, you will lose not only your safety, in other words, you too might also die, but you will also, as many, many centuries ago, lose. Amites means to lose or to send away. Certainly the honor of the Roman people. This is second declension, genitive singular. So there it is right there for the Populi Romani. And then the certe, which means certainly. I think I need to add that in my text here. Put it right here. For thus we have learned by our ancient forefathers to wage war with great strength rather than deception, because if you lead your army against us, not only your safety, but also certainly the honor of the Roman people you will lose, right? So again, if you want to put amites, you will lose somewhere earlier in that sentence, that's fine. But I'm going to keep it kind of literal for reasons of explication of the Latin text. Okay, so now we got a little bit of rhythm here. We're almost done here. Literally to these, but Caesar, so again, Latin likes to use ita a lot. So thus Caesar responded to these ambassadors. Caesar, remember this is from his De Bello Gallico. It's interesting for reasons we can't go into in this online format. Caesar refers to himself in the third person singular. And here he's saying that that even if, so ATMC, right, even if I could post them, lay aside, again, I have the written text next to me, and I'm just going to write it down, then I'll explain it by sharing with you the screen rather. Even if I could lay aside, I guess, the memory All right, so Caesar's responding to these legatos or ambassadors. So even if, then here we have it in the subjunctive. This is the way Latin works. I could, again, post sum would be the regular, but this is in the subjunctive. Even if I could deponere, like a deposition, here they give us what that means, to lay aside. Even if I could lay aside, and then lay aside what? The accusative direct object is memoriam. So that's first declension accusative singular, fairly straightforward grammar at this point. So that's what he's saying. Even if I could lay aside the memory of your prior, not lives, but vices or crimes. Once again, we've seen this word before in a different lesson. Vitiorum, fault, crimes, sins, defects. You choose one that fits your style of writing. Even if I could lay aside the crimes of your previous vices, I can certainly not ignore, or can also mean forgive, ignoscere, forgive your most recent crimes, literally your new crimes. And so this one is a little bit tricky because of the case endings, but I think if we just know the vocab, it's such a short clause, I think we kind of know what's going on here. So ignoscere can maybe forgive as well, if you want to change that to forgive. So, and then he says, unless you give, right, those hostages, right? So the idea is that it was standard practice back then to give hostages as part of warfare. So unless you give those hostages, so there's our vocab over there, I will not make peace with you. So that one's again, not too difficult if we know the vocab. And here he's saying, this is in the future tense. So if you want to work backwards, I will not make peace with you, pacem vobiscumque, unless you give those hostages. But then we switch back to the Helvetians. The Helvetians, if they, I guess in this case, right, if they had conceded to Caesar, I'm going to write that down and then explain that. This one, what makes this one not tricky, but we just need to know what this verb means. And so, sent, so let's just look that up if we're not sure. Oops, I have to type here. So this is pluperfect active subjunctive, but we have a variety of options. I've chosen conceded, yielded. If you want to say submitted, that would work as well. So based on the context. And then conceded to Caesar. So notice Caesar ends in I because third declension, dative singular is I. You concede or submit to someone. Remember, the dative is to or for whom something is done. So knowing that grammar point, I think, helps us with that clause. So to Caesar. So to means then, sort of the chain of events, if you will. The Helvetians, if they had then conceded to Caesar, they would have found a better fortune. They eventually do not, even though this text doesn't go in great detail, they do not find a good fortune. You can imagine what happened next. But this is where we get the word invention. So they would have found, and then that's simply the comparative form of melior, which is better. So bonus, melior, and then this is fairly straightforward in terms of just first declension, accusative singular. But they responded arrogantly. So that one's fairly straightforward, going back to the topic of this passage. Deals with an arrogant adversary. But they responded arrogantly. And then what do they say? They say, literally, to us from our ancestors, this custom is given. The Helvetia, to accept hostages, not to give. And so what's going on here is, what it is in the dative, but I'm going to change this, and I'm going to just, let me write it out and then I'll explain it. So it, oops, let me see, let's see, it. Okay, so again, I've given that a slightly more free translation, but literally, to us from our ancestors, this custom is given. The Helvetians accept hostages, they don't give. So I wish they had gone this text had gone a little bit further into the story, because it gets pretty interesting next. It kind of stops before Caesar really has done anything other than tell them, to meet his demands, which they don't. Eventually, they're going to regret that mistake. But here they're saying that Caesar has said, you need to give us hostages, and they're saying, no, it's our ancient custom not to be dictated to. We're not going to give you hostages, but rather you need to give us hostages. And so that's sort of the sense of it here, is that Helvetia, accept hostages, not give, is our ancient custom. I would encourage you to read a little bit further, even in an English translation, to see what happens next. This is Book 1, Section 13 of De Bella Gallico, because things get pretty interesting in terms of the Gallic War, but also it tells us a lot about the power of Rome at this time, and especially Caesar's abilities as a commander. All right, so that is it. Your final exam, as noted earlier, will be based on these 3 longer readings: Lucretia, Paragon of Virtue, Virgil praises the rustic life, and now the Helvetians parley with Caesar. You will also be responsible for the vocabulary that accompanies each of these readings, which is in the margins of these 3 texts, which I've included and also sent to you, or in many cases given you a hard copy, so make sure you know that. And you haven't had a essay in a while, but you will have one on the final exam, dealing with some broad topic, for example, virtue or the rustic life, or in this case, military strategies. It'll be a broad topic. It really isn't something you can prepare for other than being thoughtful. Preparing the Latin will give you the ability to write thoughtfully about these topics in a short essay, as you've done in previous semesters. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I believe, even though I'll indicate this per email, our final exam is this Saturday at 6 p.m. in D. Rich. And then also, don't forget, which is 10% of your grade, your final project on a topic that you chose, that you were interested in learning more about. Valete.